Imagine it's 29 June 2015. You are a 79-year-old pensioner living in Athens, Greece. Your name is Zena Razi, and your apartment is quiet except for the sound of the television and the click of the wall clock. Your monthly pension is 650 euros, and 180 euros of that could disappear if the latest cuts go through. Your middle-aged son has no job, so your money is not really your money anymore. It is rent, medicine, power bills, bread, and the thin thread holding two lives together. You used to go to the cinema. You used to think retirement would feel smaller than working life, but calmer. Now the banks are shutting, cash machines are rationing money, and the floor under ordinary life feels like wood that has gone soft from rot. If you have ever wondered why some assets become lifeboats while others turn into anchors the moment a recession begins, stay with me. What you're about to hear is not a theory. It is a pattern. It has happened before in different countries in different decades under different flags. And if you find value in this kind of historical clarity, subscribing takes 2 seconds and keeps you ahead of what most people never see coming. By that afternoon, Greece has imposed capital controls. Banks close for weeks. Cash withdrawals are capped at 60 euros a day. On paper, Zena still has savings, still has a pension, still lives inside the euro. In real life, access matters more than paper. Liquidity matters more than promises. Safety is no longer a line on a bank statement. It is whatever can still move when everything else freezes. That is what this video is about. Not the fantasy of an asset that never falls, never scares you, never tests your nerve. History does not offer that. What it does offer is a brutal lesson. In recessions, and especially in recessions that grow teeth and turn into banking or currency crises, the list of truly safe assets becomes very short. Usually it shrinks toward the strongest government debt, insured cash, and when trust in the local money itself starts to die, assets outside the local system, such as hard foreign currency or gold, not because they are magical, because they sit highest in the chain of promises. And when the lower floors collapse, height is everything. Before we go further, there is something important to understand. A safe asset is not simply an asset that goes up. It is an asset people run to when they stop trusting almost everything else. Think of the economy as a city built on bridges over dark water. In good times, people cross any bridge without thinking. They buy stocks, rental flats, junk bonds, startups, crypto, second homes, fine art, whatever promises more return. But a recession is the storm that tests the bolts. Suddenly, nobody cares which bridge looked beautiful in sunshine. They care which one will still hold a truck at midnight. This is the mechanism beneath the surface. In a downturn, income gets weaker, debts get heavier, and fear spreads faster than facts. When fear spreads, investors and families start asking a simpler question. Not what pays the most, but who is most likely to pay me back on time in money that still means something? That question creates a flight to safety. Money leaves risky assets and crowds into the strongest promises it can find. And here's the secret key. Safety is always relative. It depends on what kind of recession you're facing. If the problem is a normal business slump, then the safest place has often been short-term government debt and high-quality sovereign bonds, especially in countries with strong tax systems and central banks. If the problem is a banking panic, insured deposits matter because access to cash becomes survival. If the problem is a currency collapse, then local cash can become a melting ice cube, and safety moves outside the local money entirely. The same word, safe, but a different staircase and a different fire. That is why so many people get this wrong. They search for one permanent answer. History gives a different answer. Safety is not a brand name. It is a rank in the order of trust. The first clear example came in the United States after the great stock market crack of 1929. On 28th October 1929, Black Monday, the Dow Jones Industrial Average fell nearly 13%. On the next day, Black Tuesday, it fell nearly 12% more. By 8th July 1932, the Dow had crashed from its peak of 381.17 to just 41.92. That was not a bad year. That was financial amputation. For ordinary Americans, the collapse did not feel like a chart. It felt like a room losing oxygen. Factories cut shifts, stores closed early, men in good suits stood in bread lines, families moved in together because rent was suddenly too heavy for one paycheck, or for no paycheck at all, and then came the bank failures. Between the fall of 1930 and the winter of 1933, the money supply in the United States fell by nearly 30% as the banking system broke down. People did not just lose paper wealth. Many lost access to deposits they thought were as solid as brick. Now, here's where it gets interesting. While stocks were being smashed, treasury bills and treasury bonds held up far better. According to the long-run return data compiled at NYU Stern, a dollar amount invested at the start of 1928 had fallen to about 50.66 in stocks by the end of 1932, but had grown to about 114.96 in 3-month treasury bills and about 116.44 in 10-year treasury bonds. Think about that. The same country, the same depression, the same fear. One part of the financial house burned, another part became the fire escape. Why? Because investors were not rewarding growth. They were paying for certainty. In a depression, the value of a strong promise goes up. If prices are falling, jobs are disappearing, and businesses are going broke, then being repaid by the U.S. government in cash becomes more valuable, not less. The return is not only the interest. The return is the fact that you still have optionality. Optionality is a complex word, but the idea is simple. It means you still have choices when other people do not. That matters more than most people realize. The family that kept some money in liquid, high-quality claims could wait. Waiting is a hidden superpower in a crash. They did not have to sell the house into a falling market. They did not have to dump stocks at the bottom to buy coal or shoes. They could survive the winter of the cycle. And in every major recession, survival is phase one. Opportunity only comes later. Look at what happened next. In March 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt declared a national banking holiday. The entire commercial banking system was shut, so officials could inspect which banks were still sound. Imagine the emotional shock of that. Your savings are not just down. They are behind a locked door, and the government is deciding which doors will reopen. That is when people learn the oldest rule in finance. A claim is only as safe as the institution that stands behind it. This brings us directly to the deeper lesson from the 1930s. During a recession, the safe asset is usually not the thing with the best story. It is the thing linked to the strongest balance sheet. In the United States of the Depression era, that balance sheet was federal debt, not common stocks, not small bank deposits before deposit insurance, not leveraged farms, and not real estate financed with fragile credit. Safety looked boring, but boring is often just another word for alive. There's another layer here that most people miss. The New Deal later created the FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance, because the crisis had shown that unprotected bank deposits were not truly cash-like at all. They were promises from private institutions that could fail. Once the government wrapped insurance around deposits, the rank of that asset changed. It moved higher in the order of trust. In other words, safety did not come from the paper statement. It came from the strength of the guarantor. Here is something I want you to think about before we go further. If your bank balance depends on a private bank, your stock portfolio depends on market buyers, and your house depends on somebody else's mortgage approval, which of those would still feel safest if tomorrow morning fear spread faster than truth? Drop your answer in the comments. Seriously. Because what I'm about to show you next is the part of this story that most people never hear, and it changes everything. Fast forward to the United States in 2008. The country was richer, faster, more digital, more connected, and supposedly much wiser than it had been in 1929. Yet the mechanism was almost the same. In August 2007, stress began to spread through markets tied to bad mortgages. In March 2008, Bear Stearns had to be rescued. On 15th September 2008, Lehman Brothers failed. And once Lehman went down, trust ran through the system like a crack through ice. From peak to trough, U.S. GDP fell by 4.3% during the Great Recession. Unemployment more than doubled, rising from under 5% to 10%. Average home prices, which had more than doubled between 1998 and 2006, fell by over 1/5 from the first quarter of 2007 to the second quarter of 2011. For millions of families, the home was not just a house. It was the main store of wealth, the college fund, the emergency reserve, the imagined retirement. Then the house became a trap. That is what recessions do. They turn confidence into collateral and then break the collateral. But again, observe where money fled. The St. Louis Fed noted that even as the U.S. Treasury issued vast amounts of new debt, demand for treasuries rose so strongly that prices increased and yields fell. Holdings of marketable Treasury securities rose from $4.9 trillion in August 2008 to $7.4 trillion by February 2010. Three-month Treasury bill yields fell sharply and were near zero by November 2008. That sounds dull until you understand what it means. The world was so desperate for safety that it accepted almost no return in exchange for getting principal back. At the same time, the U.S. government temporarily raised FDIC deposit insurance to $250,000 in October 2008, and the FDIC created a program guaranteeing certain transaction accounts in full. Why? To stop Renzo. To tell households, firms, and cities that their cash would still be there. Again, the key was not excitement. It was confidence. In a panic, people do not ask for glamour. They ask for a dry floor. Think of 2008 as an office tower where the power suddenly fails. The fancy penthouse views no longer matter. People rush for the emergency stairwell, the concrete core of the building. In that moment, U.S. Treasuries were the stairwell. Insured deposits were the flashlight in your hand. Stocks, private credit, and over-leveraged property were the elevators with blinking red lights. Ordinary people lived this in painfully physical ways. Couples opened retirement accounts and saw balances cut almost in half. Workers watched neighbors leave homes with foreclosure stickers on the door. Small business owners discovered that even a healthy business can choke if banks stop lending. Parents delayed college plans. Young adults moved back home. Even people who kept their jobs learned a new fear, that assets priced every day can make you feel rich for years and poor in 6 months. Yet those who came through the period with the most stability usually shared one trait. They had something liquid that did not depend on a rising market to be useful. They had cash backed by a credible guarantee, treasury bills, or high-quality government bonds that rose as panic deepened. This was not because they were prophets, it was because they were standing closer to the issuer that the market still trusted. And there is one more uncomfortable fact. In 2008, many assets people called safe were not safe at all. OSTA mortgage securities, supposedly high-grade bonds built from home loans, were treated as respectable until they were suddenly radioactive. Safety had been painted onto them like cheap gold paint on rotten wood. A recession scrapes that paint off. This leads to the second part of the story. What if the recession is not just a market crash, but a crisis of the local currency and the local banking system itself? Then the safe asset changes again? Argentina showed that with painful clarity in 2001 and 2002. For years, the peso had been pegged 1-to-1 to the US dollar. To ordinary people, that peg felt like a steel ruler, straight, solid, trustworthy, but it was more like a ruler drawn on paper. As recession dragged on, debt piled up, and confidence drained away, depositors realized there were not enough real dollars in the system to cover all the promises being made. The trigger was brutally simple. People ran to the banks. The government responded with the corralito, the little corral, announced in early December 2001. Cash withdrawals were limited to 250 pesos or dollars a week. You could transfer money inside the system, but getting cash out became hard. That may sound technical. It was not technical for the shopkeeper who paid workers in cash, the family buying food day to day, or the grandmother who did not trust cards. It was as if the blood was still inside the body, but no longer reaching the fingers. And then the whole structure snapped. Argentina defaulted on about $85 billion of debt. The currency depreciated from 1 peso per US dollar to more than 3 pesos per dollar in a matter of weeks. GDP per person fell by around 20% over the crisis period. Unemployment rose to 25%. Poverty reached 55% of the population. Millions of middle-class Argentines felt themselves drop through the floor in slow motion. Now look closely at what survived better. Not local deposits trapped inside the corralito, not peso savings, not claims that depended on the peg staying alive. The assets that held up best were the ones outside the weakest promise. Dollar bills held abroad, cash stored outside the banks, export earnings, and in some cases, gold or hard goods that could keep value while the local unit collapsed. Reuters, writing years later, captured the memory in one line from a 70-year-old Argentine saver named Stella. "I prefer to have my savings at home. It's my insurance for the next few years, and I don't want any doubts." That is not a textbook sentence. It is scar tissue. Why did the winners look so different here than in the United States in 1932 or 2008? Because the strongest balance sheet in Argentina was not Argentina. The local state could not anchor trust. The local banks could not honor every claim. So safety moved up and out. The ladder of trust did not end inside the country. It extended beyond it, toward the dollar and away from domestic promises. Japan, in a quieter way, revealed another version of the same principle. After its bubble burst in the early 1990s, Japan entered what became known as the lost decade, and then really the lost decades. Growth averaged about 1% a year over the 1990s. Nominal GDP in 2001 was about the same as in 1995. Deflation took hold. Land and stock values sagged for years, yet yields on Japanese government bonds fell to around 1%, despite downgrades and heavy public debt. The market was saying something important. In a stagnant, low-growth world, even a tiny, dependable stream of government payments becomes precious. When the future looks empty, certainty gains weight. Now look at all three together. The same mechanism, different countries, different decades, same result. In the United States during the Depression, investors fled to treasury bills and bonds because the federal government remained the strongest payer in the room. In the United States, in 2008, they rushed again to treasuries and insured deposits because the deepest demand was not for high returns, but for unquestioned repayment and immediate liquidity. In Argentina, when the state and banks themselves lost credibility, safety moved outside the domestic system toward dollars and assets not trapped by local promises. Most people will never know what you now know. Most people will keep trusting systems they do not understand. If you are still here, you are not most people. Hit subscribe. Because the next section is the part this channel was made for, the part they never put in textbooks. At this point, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Safe assets are not chosen by tradition, they are chosen by hierarchy. During a recession, money climbs the ladder of credibility. It leaves whatever depends on growth, leverage, or fragile financing, and it moves toward whatever still has the power to pay, settle, and remain liquid under stress. It is a stampede toward the strongest promise still standing. That is why the phrase flight to safety is so useful. The flight is fast, emotional, and directional. People do not sit calmly and optimize during a panic. They run, and they run toward whatever they believe other people will also trust tomorrow morning. Safety is social before it is mathematical. If everyone accepts U.S. Treasury bills, then Treasury bills become even more powerful in a crisis. If nobody wants pesos, pesos become even weaker. Trust feeds on itself, just as fear does. This is also why many popular assets fail the safety test. A rental apartment may hold value over decades, but it is illiquid. You cannot shave off one bathroom to pay a hospital bill. Stocks can recover brilliantly, but they can also fall 50% right when you need cash. Corporate bonds can look solid until refinancing dries up. Gold can protect against currency ruin, but it may not behave like the best asset in an ordinary recession with deflation. Safety is not one crown worn forever. It is a title passed to whichever claim survives the current battlefield. And this is where history gets uncomfortable. The people hurt most are usually not reckless gamblers. They are often the disciplined middle class, the savers, the pensioners, the wage earners, the shop owners who followed the rules of the old system right until the old system changed. Look at Greece again. In 2015, banks shut and withdrawals were capped at 60 euros a day after emergency central bank support was frozen. Reuters reported that the average Greek pension had fallen to 833 euros a month from 1,350 euros in 2009, and that 45% of pensioners received less than the poverty line of 665 euros. People like Zina Razi were not living lavishly. They were paying water bills, keeping food in the kitchen, and helping unemployed children. Their asset was not a portfolio. It was a pension promise. And even that promise became thinner each year. Look at Cyprus in 2013. Under a bailout agreement, deposits above 100,000 euros at Bank of Cyprus took a 47.5% hit and were converted into shares. Imagine building a business over 20 years, keeping working cash in what you think is a normal bank account, and then waking up to learn that nearly half of the uninsured part has been transformed by decree. Notice stolen in the dramatic way movies show theft. Something colder than that. Reclassified. Go further back to Weimar Germany in 1923. Before the First World War, $1 US was worth just over 4 marks. By November 1923, it took 1 trillion marks to buy $1. Britannica describes the period in simple, horrifying images, prices rising so fast that a cup of coffee could cost 5,000 marks, and then 7,000 marks by the time the second cup arrived. Wheelbarrows of cash that could not buy a newspaper, pensioners starving while debtors saw debts vaporize. In that kind of collapse, local cash is not safe at all. It is a candle in a furnace. So who came through relatively intact? Usually not the salaried worker paid in the weakening unit. Not the pensioner on a fixed income. Not the small saver whose money was trapped in the wrong bank, the wrong currency, or the wrong legal wrapper. The people who held up best were often those with assets one step higher in the trust chain. Insured deposits and stable systems. Short-term government paper from credible states. Foreign currency, gold, export income, or low debt. And enough liquidity to wait. They did not always get rich, but they stayed standing. That difference is everything. Recessions do not only destroy wealth, they sort society by liquidity. They separate the people who can wait from the people who must sell. And forced selling is where so much hidden damage begins. A crisis is not just a storm, it is an auction held in bad light. You can see that sorting process with brutal clarity in Cyprus. In 2013, after the island's banking system was crushed by losses tied in part to Greece, capital controls arrived. The BBC reported that daily cash withdrawals in Cyprus were capped at 300 euros per person. People could not freely move money abroad. Businesses faced reviews before larger payments could be approved. Then came the deeper wound. At Bank of Cyprus, deposits above 100,000 euros were hit with a 47.5% conversion into shares. Reuters said that amounted to roughly 8 billion euros of depositors' money being turned into bank equity. If you were a wealthy oligarch, that hurt. But if you were a normal business owner who kept payroll cash in the bank, because that is what a normal business owner is supposed to do, it could be crippling. The asset looked like money. In the moment that mattered, it behaved like hostage collateral. The same social sorting appears in Greece, but in a more drawn-out, grinding way. A pensioner with 550 euros a month could not simply wait out policy talks in Brussels. A man like Stelios Vitsilios, quoted by Reuters in 2017, had started work at age 14 and was living on a pension that had fallen to 550 euros a month, about 100 euros less than before. Another retiree, Trianos Softsis, said his €800 pension had been cut to 650 and that he was helping children and grandchildren. Now, these are not numbers from a spreadsheet alone. They are dinner tables with fewer plates of meat. They are winter apartments with lower heat. They are grandparents becoming the last shock absorbers in a country where a quarter of the workforce was jobless. And once you see that, the phrase safe asset starts to change shape. For a pensioner, safety is not a perfect annual return. It is the ability to buy medicine on Thursday. For a shopkeeper, it is the ability to pay suppliers before shelves go empty. For a small factory owner, it is the ability to make payroll without selling equipment into a dead market. Safety is not abstract. It is practical. It is groceries wearing a necktie. Now think again about Weimar Germany. Hyperinflation, which means prices rising so fast that money loses value faster than people can spend it, did not hit everyone in the same way. Debtors often saw real burdens shrink because they could repay old debts with ruined money. Owners of tangible assets, foreign currency, or gold had some protection. But pensioners, salaried workers, and cautious savers were cut to pieces. The prudent people, the people who had done exactly what respectable society had told them to do, watched years of thrift turn into wallpaper. That is one of history's cruelest jokes. Inflation often punishes discipline first. Japan offers the quieter mirror image. There was no wheelbarrow of cash, no screaming crowds outside banks, no trillion-mark notes. Instead, there was a long, cold drizzle of stagnation. Asset prices sank, growth slowed, deflation pushed people to wait. And in that world, a Japanese government bond yielding around 1% could still be attractive because a weak economy and falling prices made certainty more valuable than excitement. It was not dramatic, but it was still a lesson. Sometimes the safe asset in a recession is not the thing that makes you richer. It is the thing that lets time pass without breaking you. This is also why gold appears again and again in stories of severe stress, but usually for a specific reason. Gold is not a company. It is not a bank deposit. It does not rely on one government balance sheet. In an ordinary recession, that may not make it the best performing refuge. In fact, U.S. Treasuries often did better in deflationary panics. But when people stop trusting the currency itself, gold becomes a kind of financial lifeboat that floats outside the legal promises of the local system. In Weimar Germany, in Zimbabwe, and in many smaller currency disasters, that independence mattered. It was not yield people were buying. It was escape velocity. Look at how often ordinary families misunderstand this. They say their home is safe because it is real. They say their bank balance is safe because the number does not move every day. They say a pension is safe because the state owes it. But history shows that reality is layered. A house can be real and still impossible to sell. A bank balance can look stable and still be trapped by capital controls. A pension can exist and still buy less each year. During a recession, appearances are stage props. The script belongs to liquidity, law, and trust. So the people who suffered most were often standing in the exact place society told them was responsible. Middle-class savers in Argentina kept deposits in the banking system and got trapped. Large uninsured depositors in Cyprus learned that a bank account can be partly converted into something else by force. Greek pensioners relied on the state's promise and watched each round of cuts scrape away more dignity. German savers in 1923 discovered that cash itself can die. Once you understand this, you stop asking which asset sounds respectable. You start asking which promise still works when the lights flicker. The historical record shows that those who came through these periods largely shared three characteristics. First, they respected liquidity. They kept part of their wealth in something that could be used immediately without begging a buyer, a banker, or a bureaucracy for permission. Second, they avoided heavy leverage. Leverage means debt used to amplify returns. In good times, it feels like a tailwind. In recessions, it turns into a rip current. Third, they understood which promise in their country was strongest, and they changed behavior when that promise weakened. The question is not whether this pattern will repeat. History has already answered that. The only question is whether you will see it before it sees you. If this channel helps you think differently about the world you live in, subscribe. It costs nothing, and it might change everything. Notice what this does not mean. It does not mean there is one universal asset to buy and forget forever. The Great Depression rewarded U.S. government bonds and later insured cash. The 2008 panic rewarded treasuries and insured deposits again. Argentina punished local claims and favored dollars outside the trap. Weimar punished local money itself. Japan rewarded patience in a low-growth world where government bonds kept gaining importance as deflation lingered. The pattern is not a product list. It is a map of trust. That map can help ordinary people think more clearly. When you hear the phrase safe asset, ask safe from what? Safe from a stock crash? Safe from bank failure? Safe from inflation? Safe from capital controls? Safe from being unable to pay this week's bills? Those are different threats, and history shows that the wrong safe asset for the wrong crisis can fail at the exact moment it is needed most. Still, one truth keeps coming back like a tide. In recession after recession, assets closest to the power to tax, print, insure, or settle tend to sit at the center of safety. In strong states, that usually means government debt and guaranteed cash. In weak states, people climb beyond the state itself and look for harder currency or tangible stores of value. The names change, the mechanism does not. So return now to Zina Razi in Athens. Her world did not end in one cinematic explosion. It narrowed. That is how most financial suffering looks. A little less cash, a little less heat, a little more debt, a son still out of work, fewer visits to the cinema, more time spent measuring every purchase against the shape of the month. Greece eventually reopened its banks and later lifted the last capital controls, but the lesson remained. An asset is not safe because it exists. It is safe because you can still use it, trust it, and exchange it when fear arrives. That is the final lesson. The only safe assets during a recession are the claims nearest to the strongest source of trust still functioning in that moment. Sometimes that is the sovereign bond market. Sometimes it is insured cash. Sometimes it is money or value stored outside the failing local system altogether. History does not hand us comfort. It hands us a ranking. And once you see that ranking, you start to understand recessions not as random disasters, but as brutal audits of trust. This is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial advice. Every individual situation is different. Please consult a qualified professional before making any financial decision. This video is not for everyone. Most people will dismiss it. But if one person in your life needs to hear this, share it with them. Not because it will change the world, because it might change their world. Subscribe for more, and I will see you in the next one.